Benchmark School, Delaware Valley Friends School, Woodland School, and Wilson Reading Systems for their sponsorship of today's conference. As I said, we have many other sponsors. I want to invite you to make sure that you go over to Marion Hall during our break to visit with our sponsors and our vendors, and we will have a slideshow running at that break time to tell you more about those individuals. But those that we just named gave us tremendous financial support for this conference, and through that support, we have been able to offer about approximately $10,000 in scholarships for today's workshop. We offer these scholarships because we are an organization that is dedicated to not only serving individuals with dyslexia and other learning disabilities, but also to ensure through educator training that all children will be provided with science-based reading instruction. PBIDA has been an active partner with the Pennsylvania Department of Education's Dyslexia Screening and Early Literacy Intervention pilot. Our pilot ended in June, and its success will be documented in a report that will be coming out very shortly. Many people contributed to the success of the pilot, and many of those individuals are in the room today. Again, I'm not going to take up precious time from our speaker to name all those people, but I would like to just acknowledge one person who chaired our advisory committee. I know she's looking at me like, what? You didn't tell me that you were on. So Lindell is currently the Assistant Director of Special Education for the Pennsylvania Department of Education, and as I said, she is the chair of our pilot advisory committee. Lynn is retiring this week, and I want to take just a moment to ask her to stand and be recognized for her leadership and service to the pilot. Another area where PBIDA actively supports educator training is through support of IDA's accreditation and certification programs. I would like to remind, and maybe this is not a reminder, but maybe I'm pointing out for the first time, that Pennsylvania currently has the distinction of being the state with the largest number of IDA accredited programs. We are sitting on the campus of one such program right now, and I want to just mention that Arcadia University and Temple University are the two most recent universities added to the list this year. Congratulations to Arcadia and to Temple. Okay, before getting to our speaker, I know you're like, come on, hurry up. We do have an important award to give today. So the Janet L. Hoops Award is presented annually to an individual or individuals in Pennsylvania or Delaware who have made a significant contribution to the education of those living with learning disabilities. This prestigious award was established in 1993 in memory of Dr. Janet L. Hoops, a dedicated PBIDA board member and professor emeritus at Bryn Mawr College. This year's awardee, Dr. Leslie Rescorla, came to Bryn Mawr College to fill Dr. Hoops' position upon her retirement. We did not realize that when she was nominated for this award, but it's an interesting little tidbit to add to the introduction. Dr. Rescorla has spent many years in service to individuals with learning disabilities in her positions as director of the school psychology program and as director of the Bryn Mawr Child Study Institute and the Thorne Early Childhood Programs. Professor Rescorla received her clinical training at Yale Child Study Center, and the Philadelphia Child Guidance Center. Her research and interest are the epidemiology and outcome of language delay in toddlers and longitudinal patterns of academic aptitude and achievement, as well as empirically based assessment and longitudinal study of child psychopathology and competence. So her clinical practice involves psychological assessment, and someone in the room today mentioned that their own child was evaluated by Dr. Rescorla and that she will be working to reevaluate her child very soon, like next week. So At this point in time, I would like to congratulate Dr. Rescorla on being selected as the 2018 recipient of the Janet L. Hoops Award. Dr. Rescorla is out of the country, but she was able to record some remarks that I will share now. And while our tech guy is putting that on,
I'm sorry I can't be here with you in person today to accept this award, but I had a previous commitment to go to Peru and give some lectures before I knew that I'd been nominated. I'm especially honored to be receiving the Janet L. Hoops Award because Janet played such an important role in my career. It was because Janet unexpectedly decided to give up her professorship and resign from Bryn Mawr College that a position opened up which I was able to apply for and obtain. In addition, Janet so generously shared with me all of her course materials and bequeathed to me a thriving program in school psychology. This allowed me to continue training school psychologists and clinical developmental psychologists for more than 25 years, many of whom are here today. I'd like to thank the nominating committee for selecting me for this wonderful award and all of you for everything that you do to help children and adults with learning differences. Thank you.
Okay, at this time, I'd like to introduce our new PBIDA Executive Director, Diane Riott, who will introduce our speaker for today.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to our 40th Annual Fall Conference. It is my pleasure to introduce our friend, Marianne Wolf. Marianne currently directs the Center for Dyslexia, Diverse Learners, and Social Justice at UCLA and is working with the Dyslexia Center at the UCSF Medical School and with Curious Learning, a global literacy initiative which she co-founded. She is the recipient of multiple research and teaching honors, including the highest awards by the International Dyslexia Association and the Australian Learning Disability Association. She is the author of Reader Come Home, The Reading Brain in a Digital World, Proust and Squid, Tales of Literacy for the 21st Century, and more than 160 scientific publications. Most importantly, Dr. Marianne Wolf is an individual who cares deeply about children who struggle to read and works tirelessly to ensure that all individuals can enjoy their right to read. Please welcome Dr. Marianne Wolf. Thank you.
Diane. Thank you, everyone, for coming. Can you hear me? I don't feel I can be heard. Now can you hear me? Is that better? Okay. Thank you, everybody, for coming, but nobody has the same time zone I have. I got up at 4 a.m. my time to be with you, but I need you to know that I actually have no time zone. I have been in Europe giving talks. I look at Diane. Thanks to Diane and Lisa, I had dinner and wine in my room last night. Thank you so much. This helps. This helps. But I'm just recently back from Norway, where really the time zone between LA and Norway shows. So what I did, and I'm just telling you this because this is the first thing that happens in my mind when I wake up this early. I have a thyroid. Everybody has something they take every morning, right? Or most of you. So I put my little thyroid pill right there so I wake up. But I thought, you know, it's Norway. Maybe I can't sleep. So I put a very strong sleeping pill on the other side of the table so that just in case in the middle of the night I would do it. But I didn't. I fell asleep. And I wake up in the morning and I take my pill and I fall promptly asleep before my talk. I took the wrong pill. I fell totally asleep. And now it's 10 of 9 and I have to be at 9. And I realize what has happened. And I run down there and luckily, this is Norway, there were eggs with caviar on top. So this poor woman, she just wants, because if you eat, the effect is gone or almost gone. So before my talk, she said, what are these Yanks like? But it's only 6 a.m. now, so I have more energy than when it is 2 a.m. So I just want you to know I am so appreciative for you to be here on a rainy Saturday. And I'm especially appreciative because there are people whom I have seen at various times in various talks. And I have the great pleasure of 2 of my former students and now colleagues. Catherine and I look at Kathleen. Kathleen and I had a wonderful night that, thanks to her students, was made even better. So I thank you from Juniata College for coming. And I thank Pittsburgh, wherever you 50 people are, thank you also for coming. But I especially thank the Pennsylvania IDA, all of you, Maria, Lisa, Diane, all of you, and of course Monica. Thank you so much for the work. All of us know that people are behind the scenes. I can't tell you how much work it really takes, and I am so terribly appreciative. But now I'm going to make you work. And it may be a little early in the morning for you, but it's earlier for me. And so I'm going to keep you with me for 2 different lectures. Now, some of you know, and in fact, some of you have been to lectures with me before. I thank you, Rob, too, very much for helping me this morning. He was my Virgil guiding me here. I want to let you know what I'm going to be doing. This is just first for those of you who are usually thinking of me at Tufts, which I will always miss, but I'm now at UCLA starting a brand new Center for Dyslexia, Diverse Learners, and Social Justice. And we have a mission that's very much connected to yours. We look at literacy as a basic human right for everyone, regardless of background or where they are. So we're working not only in cities, and my own new city has enormous issues, but we're looking around the country and around the world to try to pull together research with schools and schools with research. But what the work involves is connection. So what I'm going to be doing this morning with you is really bringing together in 2 different lectures. When Lisa and Diane asked me to give this talk, they wanted it to be the first time in the United States. I have done this now in Europe twice in the last 2 weeks. But to bring the work that went into my new book. So at the same time, some of you have credentialing that needs extra credits. So I am putting together in the first lecture work on the research, both new and a continuing arc of research from our lab and others, that connects all these areas to look at the reading brain as the basis for understanding reading development in a different way. And from that standpoint, understanding how it can go awry in various ways. And from that standpoint, you're hearing me, we're building a platform here, layer by layer. Then we'll look at how different interventions can help us. And when I talk about different interventions, even though I will only be using 1 or 2, I'm using principles of intervention that are based every step of the way on what children with dyslexia manifest, on what the reading brain information tells us about development, and ultimately, and that will be the second lecture, how a lot of this is changing in a digital world. So the book that you've just heard about is a kind of a very odd, in some ways a very odd book, because it is written as an epistolary book, as a book of letters to people. And there was a recent review by Washington Post. I don't know if some of you saw it. It was a very nice review, except for this one line. There's always one line, right? Those of you, I look at Kathleen and Catherine. My first book for the public, Proust and the Squid, the first Washington Post, do you remember this? The title of their review was, "Reading is Hard. This book proves it." So I'm looking at the Washington Post with a little bit of a sconce in my left eyebrow. But I wrote this as a series of letters, and they said, well, it's pretty corny but charming. Okay, well, it's a lot better than their first review for my other book. But the reality is that these letters are meant to be a dialogue. And the reasons are many. How many of you remember the work by the poet Rainer Maria Rilke, Letters to a Young Poet? Do I have some fellow English majors out there? This was a beautiful book to someone who thought he might become a poet. And the reason why I love this book is not just for the lyrical beauty, but the idea of using a letter to talk to a stranger, to talk to someone you will never meet in your life, but whom you have a relationship with. And so the letter gives me a chance, just like this talk. Some of you have met me, if you will, in my book. Some of you have followed me in different lectures. But the reality is we are all coming to our books and our lectures with an entire background of knowledge. And the letter and the lecture gives me one shot at entering your background knowledge with mine. And as I go back one slide, this knowledge has many, if you will, directions to it, many perspectives. And what we're trying to do is bring in all our work what we know about how neurons make networks that use whole areas of the brain that were meant for other things to build a new circuit for reading. And so what we're doing is, especially these areas here, we're connecting it to what are the reading behaviors. And very importantly, how can we connect this information about all the cognitive, linguistic, and affective areas involved in reading? How can we connect it with what goes on in the reality, the real worlds of our classrooms? And so my hope in writing this book as a book of letters was in fact to use that as a way of saying, this is where we are this moment in time. This is what the knowledge tells us, but you have knowledge of your own. And I use some of you know that I have a secret crush on an old monk, Thomas Aquinas. He said so many wonderful things, but one of the things he said was that arguments, dialogues are so important because iron sharpens iron. What you know especially about life in a digital world, for some of you who are very much involved in the technological world, that knowledge goes beyond mine. So we are taking our knowledge bases and we're putting them together in this book. And my talks today, therefore, will be two very separate but connected talks. In the morning, we're going to look at the reading brain, and we're going to look at how it informed us about dyslexia and intervention. And then the second talk is going to take this foundation and move into a different view of reading in a digital world that is truly changing us all. Throughout, this book by Proust that I sometimes think of as almost like a companion to me daily, because Proust had this amazing view of reading in which he said it's this fertile miracle of communication that takes place in solitude. And in that space, we feel that our wisdom begins where that of the author leaves off. Anyone who has ever heard me talk knows that this view of reading is what has propelled me. It is the basis also for an epistolary approach. Now, this epistolary approach may be cornier than ever in the hinge moment in which we are changing so much. Now, Robert Darnton, the historian and who's the head of Harvard's libraries, started to say Harvard's a reading lab. The library is a reading lab. But what he said is that this moment is a hinge. What I suggest to you is that the hinge is, we're almost at the other side of the hinge. We have moved so much from a literacy base to a digital base, and yet there is a very unusual type of communication transition that's going on, because we now live in an age where science can inform us in very discrete ways about this transition, ways that no one before in other communication transitions could have. And what these changes tell us is that we are all in this moment in which our brains are changing as reading changes. Now, what do I mean by that? Literacy, literally and figuratively, will change the brain, which changes the individual, which changes society, which changes the future of our species. This is not understood by most people. Reading is so taken for granted, not by anyone who is in this room or anyone watching. You know that literacy is our foundation. And we who work in the areas of dyslexia know that we have to give literacy to all our young and our individuals with dyslexia. But what we also have to square off with is that it has all begun to change. How we move in this transition from a literacy-based to a digital-based culture is up to us. And it begins with understanding what is underlying that reading brain. What is the circuit? What is changing, and do we have control over it? I suggest to you that we have far more choice than it would seem if we begin with this knowledge base. So the first thing that I need you to grapple with, if you haven't read my first book, Proust and the Squid, or heard me talk before, is the simplest sentence that is a continuous insight. The brain wasn't meant to read. The brain was meant to do all kinds of wonderful things. See, taste, feel, think, not read. We weren't set up. We have not a single gene in our body that's meant to be a program to unfold the way oral language does. Oral language, you put a child anywhere in an environment and language will unfold. That is not the case with reading. Reading is something very unique and special. And I was with the psychologist Ellen Winter at the Boston Book Festival, and she was saying, what is so interesting, she studies language and art, she said, you know, we don't appreciate the fact that reading is unique to us in ways that other functions aren't. And the reason why I emphasize this is because if it's unique, it means we as a species have to build something new. We build up a new circuit. Now that's a word that you commonly think of with things like electricity. You build a circuit in your house. Well, the brain has to build a whole new circuit for us to read. Now the beauty of it is that it uses these older structures that already exist. But the difference is it connects them in whole new ways. Reading makes new connections in your brain. And those of us who have studied non-literate adults who, for reasons of war or terrible conditions, especially this one study is in Portugal, those adults who then learn to read are showing different organizational patterns in their brains for other functions after they learn to read. In other words, the brain rearranges itself in new ways for us to learn to read. Now, why is that so important to the story, the big story about the reading brain in a digital world? To build that circuit, to build a new circuit, means that it's plastic. Neuroplasticity allows us to build that new circuit, but there are implications for it. We can do it because we have these design principles in our brain. We can make new connections between vision and language and affective areas that were never there before. We are able, as my colleague Stanislas Dewan talks in terms of recycling, we can recycle areas in our brain that were used for other things. Vision, we go right into certain areas and we change, literally, working groups of neurons to become responsible for letters and letter patterns and morphemes. And I need you to realize that what we are doing in reading is taking some of the working groups that were there to recognize faces. There are several faces in the front row and in this room that are familiar to me, even though, like your face is familiar. I couldn't pull out a name, but I had a few neurons for your face. It's great. They're very happy neurons. It's a beautiful face. But the reality is, when we learn to read, we take those working groups of neurons and we refunction them. In fact, some of the neuronal working groups for our facial recognition move over to the right hemisphere after they become responsible for letters. Now, what difference does that make to you who teach? How many of you teach? Many, many, many of you teach. How many of you have heard the phrase from the ancient 1970s, kill and drill? Have you heard that phrase before? This is the most ignominious, ignorant of the neuroscience principles of the visual cortex. Because when we are asking neurons to become responsible for letters, letter patterns, morphemes, what we are doing is giving exposure after exposure after exposure. Those who believe that making children, forcing children to learn multiple times do not understand that's what the brain needs. So if by any chance anyone ever uses that, as I said, ignominious phrase, in front of you, say, no, I'm giving multiple exposures to the visual cortex to make working groups for letters, okay? That's what you're doing. These are very important implications for us who would teach that brain to begin to be able to recognize first and then become responsible for these patterns that are at the basis of decoding. So this principle here, recycling and repurposing, is very important to know for educators. That's what we are doing. Second principle under this is that our children and individuals with dyslexia take more exposures, require more exposures for good reasons because of the way their brain is set up in a different way. They require more exposures still. There is some research that even suggests that instead of like 5 to 10 exposures to learn for an average person, it can take 100, which is why some of you have rued the day when on Monday that wonderful child who's in front of you knows it's cold, and on Wednesday it's cold indeed. It's gone. There's a reason. It takes exposure after exposure. And that's part of our job, to make it so that it's a pleasurable thing to have multiple exposure and anything but kill and drill. Third, we have a principle that will be haunting me. It has been haunting me now for 10 years. The reality is the neuroplasticity that makes us able to learn a new circuit isn't ever going to make one ideal circuit. That circuit is going to reflect the characteristics of the writing system, the instructional principles that we're emphasizing some processes over others, and the medium. Now, if you look, we will come back to medium in 1 minute. If you look at the average, this is a real overarching meta-analysis. You'll see how complicated it really is. But alphabets use a lot of these areas. But look at the Japanese system, and you'll see some differences there. But look at kanji. Do you see how the right hemisphere is utilized there? Why? Why would this be different from this English alphabet versus the Chinese? We're in an interactive way. Yes. Yes.
Well, because the occipital lobe is recognizing the pictorial cue.
Oh, very good. The occipital lobe is recognizing the pictorial aspect. So you've got more image. But what other reason? That's absolutely right. What other reason might there be that you need all of this right hemisphere cortex? Yes, you. Right, so that there is a conceptual, if you will, symbol, which is absolutely correct. One more reason, yes. Tonal language, there's another difference, but what one other one? Yes. It doesn't have anything to do with the alphabetic versus the language of symbols. It does indeed. Because how many symbols do you need to know? How many? 5,000 at 5th grade. I always say, oh, and you guys complain about all these little 26 letters? You got to be kidding me. This is really not to be complained about. But of course, the reality is that we have other things that are more complicated phonologically in making those matches. So the reality is there are very good reasons why there are different brains for different writing systems. Your circuit reflects what's demanded of it from the writing system, but it also reflects the emphases in your instructional, your curricula, and it will reflect the medium's affordances or characteristics. That will be the, if you will, the foreshadowing of the second lecture. Right here, we will have a brain circuit that will reflect how the medium requires particular characteristics. So we will be coming back to that principle in in the second half. Now, the reality is that what we do is in the very first part of the decoding brain, we're putting together all of these parts that are involved in vision, visual feature analysis, visual word form. A lot of work has been showing that across all languages tested so far, this area here, the visual word form area, which Stanislas Dehaene has written a great deal about, this area is very essential for us to understand in dyslexia, as well as the phonological areas. But by and large, by about 280 milliseconds, the processes in decoding that are visual, that are phonological, that are motoric, all of them, and semantic, all of them are coming together. Now, what I need you to realize, and this is about conventional views of intervention. Convention tells us you do X program with this set of emphasis or another program, and we'll come back to this in just a few minutes, with this set of emphasis. If you look at this area, these areas, you see the need to get all of them together as rapidly as possible in order to get to the point right here where we can add the heavy-duty comprehension processes. Now, there are implications for our understanding of intervention right there, because what we need to be able to do is to make the most rapid perceptual identification, connect it to our phonological system and our semantic system, and we go back and forth with attention, executive skills. Our ability to predict from context is aiding perception. These things go back and forth. Now, I need at this moment to ask you to infer what that means for intervention. Does it mean we just use this, or this, or this, or this? You know it doesn't mean one thing. It means multiple connections among the parts. It means that our interventions need to be having clearly these working groups for letters down pat. The beauty of our brain using these older parts is that they have automaticity. They can recognize anything that fast. Why? Because we'd be dead as a species without that capacity. We have rapidity, automaticity of recognition as a feature of survival, and we use it when we learn to read and learn these patterns. But our job has to be able not only to recognize those patterns instantaneously, but to know the phonemic aspect of it instantaneously. And our children who are bilingual, there are extra burdens placed on them. Our children who are bidialectical, there are extra burdens placed on them. We won't have a talk this morning on those topics, but I need you to realize that a bidialectical or a bilingual brain, at the end of the day, when a child becomes an individual and it's all perfectly fluent, the work of Ellen Bialystok and others shows us that is a fantastic brain for so many reasons. But en route, there's extra weight placed on them because there are a set of phonemes in a different dialect or a different language that have to be learned simultaneously with the standard American English phonemes. This is a heavy-duty burden that we can realize just by looking at how the brain functions. So what our job, and we'll move into this, is ultimately to make each part of that process rapid, automatic, and help the child learn to connect these parts automatically and have feedback going from context and attention. All of it has to be rapid and connected for the system to ultimately pass over that 280 millisecond and bring to bear what I will call later in the day the deep reading processes of comprehension. And we will never be content in this audience, we will never be content just to talk about this as comprehension. We are going to parse it and look at all that goes into comprehension right after the break. But now I want to bring it to bear, this information, on children's development of reading. Now of course he's not reading, and I don't want him to. And anybody who takes these terrible programs, teach your baby to read, please, please, don't tell me about it. I have written, I hope persuasively, about how disastrous it is to have reading failure at 3, much less to have children turned off to the experience by being forced pedagogically, physiologically, emotionally, and sociologically too soon to be able to put all those things together. But what we can do, and that's the good part, there's always something good, we can do the addressing of the parts of the system before reading begins. That's the good part of any of those programs that I don't want you ever to buy. What I want you to buy is a library card. This is what 0 to 5 for me means. But The child is developing the parts of the reading circuit from 0 to 5. That's what now you're ready to explore with me. In the very beginning, in the preschool years, we have very sensitive time periods for development. And so there's so much going on that literally we have all kinds of analyses by people, especially at University of Chicago, in which you see that the more you spend in that 0 to 5 or 6 period, the better the investment. If you could make any investment in the world, it would be to get that 0 to 5, 0 to 6 period in shape for our young children, our next generation. Now, I'm going to go through what are some of the aspects of the language processes that can be developing and should be developing in that early period. So I use those of you who know Reed Lyon may have heard him say this, why Marianne uses possum, that, what does he call, ugly garbage-eating marsupial, I believe is his line. I use it because it's so handy. If you think possum, that's what we are doing all the time in our educational system in terms of reading. We're looking at phonology, orthography, semantics, syntax, and morphology, but we're doing it systematically. Now, everybody in this room has been hearing about phonology and phoneme awareness for the last 10 to 20 years. In fact, this research goes back to the 1970s, and I don't need to say more. You already know this. But what you may not know is that it's equally important to be explicit about the rest of possum. You are explicit about phoneme awareness and phonology, and thank goodness you are. But the reality is we are less systematic about the rest of those brain parts, and I need to show you just a little bit about that. Semantic development happens with every time a child is interacting linguistically with their caretakers, and especially when they are listening to books or stories read to them. And I want to show you a slide that most of you know. How many of you have never seen this slide? I want to just see. Very few of you. Most of you know this part. But I always use it because there's some who do not. No matter, this may be on my gravestone. We have enormous differences in our young children's exposure to language. We must never take for granted that a child who comes to us in school isn't part of this enormous gap between our children who are in advantaged homes versus disadvantaged. And this does not mean money. Some of our poorest immigrant families do the best job of instilling a love of language and education in their children. It's not about money, but it is about the fact that so many of our disadvantaged families don't realize how important language development is. And this study has been replicated in so many different ways, most recently by my colleagues, John Gabrielli at MIT lab, where we're really also proving at a physiological level that there's a quality, not just a quantity, but a quality of language interaction that will predict later development. So it's not just quantity of language input, it is also quality. That very concretely now, this new research by John Gabrielli's group is showing physiologically we are changing. Now, we're not just changing language. This is what I'm going to come back to this like over and over again in my lecture. What we are doing in language is creating concepts too. It's not just words. We are trying our very best, who are working in these 0 to 5 periods, and you'll see in 1 minute with pediatricians as well as educators, because it's that old Matthew effect that Keith Stanovich said for language. The rich get richer and the poor get poorer. It's not just about language. It's about what children know, their whole conceptual development. Children who hear stories, who hear language, are getting richer cognitive development along with those words. I'm working with a group. How many of you know the Reach Out and Read Pediatricians group? Some of you. You need to have them in your cities, your towns, wherever you are. Pediatricians need to be, they're the first responders in this 0 to 5 period. They need to be doing what so many of their colleagues are, which is to look at shared reading as a way to stimulate brain development. And so what they do is they simply, at every well visit, give a book or 2 books that are appropriate for the age of the child. That's all they do. And they talk about shared reading. And the results are amazing. My colleague John Hutton from Cincinnati Hospital for Sick Children is looking at what happens to the children who, they're all from the same basic group. What happens to those children who receive simply those books and their mothers or fathers or caretakers are reading to them every night? That's all. That's the only condition. And what you see is that this area here, which is part and parcel of semantic processing, is developing more than the kids who don't get this. Not only is it in receptive, learning all of this, but if you look at the next slide, you see that even expressive language is going on in more activated ways in the brains of the little ones. Now, there are a few things, and I'll come back to this group later. There are definite things happening in our society in which some of the mothers who are reading on their left hand to the child, and then what are they doing with their right hand? Checking Facebook. This is exactly what they're doing. It's like, oh my God, we are ruining the study. This is a reality that we, in various ways, must confront. What is the nature? It's not just the quantity of interaction. It is the quality of our interactions with language that are so important. But we have ample data now to show that literally the brains of our children change in the language areas the more that we interact with them with our books. And here we have also data. Elizabeth Norton, another PhD student of mine who's now at Northwestern, we can even see the kids who are in families with a history of dyslexia, they are doing better later the more that they are listening to stories. Now, as the children listen to the story, they're also looking at the orthography. They're looking at letters. They're beginning to understand that the letters stay on the same page. They're just beginning to get all these orthographic cues. But they're also eventually going to learn to read. And I use this slide. There are only 2 slides here that I have kept out of all the slides for the last multiple years. Those of you who have been with me before know that my next slide is why spelling is important to learn. Okay? Some of you have seen this, some of you haven't. And for those of you who've seen it, forgive me. Someone someday is going to give me a better one, but this is the one that I've used for 10 years. Why spelling is important. Kathleen and Catherine, you've seen this 100 times. I think that's enough. There are certain lines that no matter what, I just love. The reality is that our orthography has rules that a spell check doesn't always allow us to. It's not about spell check or no spell check. It's about learning the rules of our language. And one of the other aspects of learning those rules is learning how sentences work. Now, this is so important that I get really upset with what's happening in this world because it is decreasing, diminishing the use of syntax. There is one brain out there in particular that is single-handedly atrophying the syntactic principles of the brain. I will just simply call that the Twitter brain. The Twitter brain is reducing syntax and not just amount of words. Now, those of you who think, well, you know, syntax is something, well, everyone learns. No, it's not true. My former teacher, Carol Chomsky, wife of Noam Chomsky, she showed in her research how syntax develops with all these interactions that we have with print in those early years. And we are systematically reducing syntax. Well, what is the big deal about syntax? Syntax is the structure of thought. As you become more and more able to handle complexity, syntax is one of our Beatrices, if you will, to the development of complex thought. If I facetiously accuse the world of developing Twitter brains that go no whither in terms of complexity, there's another side to that. We become ill-accustomed to the complexity of issues that go into everyday life. And Twitter, it has many a good purpose, but it is destroying, in my opinion, the ability of some people really to think and to read in more complex ways. And that is as much a part of that reading brain as ultimately as phonology and orthography and semantics. Because as we build syntax, we build the capacity to handle complexity of thought and of feeling, both. So we really need to understand how important this is in terms of language development, but also back to our jobs in increasing fluency. Syntax, when not understood, will defeat the reader. As we go into that fourth grade moment, which is the hinge moment in elementary education, fourth grade is the grade I am most concerned about because our teachers they have not received development that helps them learn how to teach reading in fourth grade. And so the children who come to them, it is assumed that they know how to read. Fluency requires not just automaticity in what we're talking about, phonology, connecting to the letters, orthography, connecting to semantics. It requires connections to syntactic function and use. If you do not have syntactic knowledge, by the time you get to fourth grade, where syntax increases in its demands, fluency is going to be suffering. Fluency is not about rereading. I really love it when people do rereading exercises, but it's going to help them reread that exercise. It's fine, but it is insufficient to understand syntax is increasingly important in the development of fluency. Morphology is what I have always called the secret sauce of the linguistic system. Why? And some of you know this already, but when you have children who look at a word with 6 or 8 letters and say, I can't do it, but if they look at that same word and they see 2 chunks or 3 chunks that they know, they can do it. This knowledge about the root system and how our language works. Our language, we have the simplest and beautiful ways of teaching it from the start. When you look at a word like bat, what about batted, bats? What about rebatting? all of these words with multiple letters are made simpler in terms of fluency and in terms of recognition by understanding what the morphemes in our language do. And so a lot of you have been doing this work on morphology, but especially in 3rd, 4th, and 5th grade, I suggest that you start from the beginning, understanding that these little tiny letters have a function, and we make it part of how we teach. Now, if we pull this all together again, what you now see is what we started with. We have our orthography. We're learning and getting that automatic. We have our ability to use context to help us understand the semantic uses, the syntactic uses, and we put all of this together and we're ready to do something enormously important, and that is to think about what we're reading. I'll come back to this after the break, but this is the thinking stuff of who you are. These are the deep reading processes. And it is only about 100 to 200 milliseconds that we do it in. But now here's a forecasting, a warning, if you will. We can just use our brains right here, and we don't necessarily make the leap into deep reading. And I will insist the entire day with you that one of the great responsibilities you and I have is to understand how important this Proustian pause, if you will, is, because you, not just your kids, you are not allocating time to it in the same way you did in the past. Not a single one of you reads the same way you did 5 years ago. And it's not just about what you have read. It's also about how you are reading. We'll come back to this, but this is very important to understand. Our kids have to learn to make that leap to think. Read to think. It's not just about decoding. We have rightly made an emphasis on decoding, the crux of our work in the early years. But at no point should it be separated from our children realizing we're reading to think and feel and understand our world in better ways. Now, how does this help us understand dyslexia? How does it help us understand what is going on in that brain? How does it help us understand whether or not this is going to be new to almost everyone in this room. Can we predict it? Can we predict it? I don't mean just, oh yeah, there's a good chance. No. Can we predict specific forms of breakdown? Yes, and we will come back to that. Now, this audience doesn't need this part of my talk, but I give it to you anyway. The cerebral diversity that Gordon Sherman gave that term, a lot of people use neural diversity. In honor of Gordon, I always use the term cerebral diversity because it is really at the heart of a better conceptualization of dyslexia. How many of you know how long we've been reading as a species? Got a guess? Yes. 5,000 to 6,000 years. You're absolutely right. Now, that's a story in itself, and I bet almost no one wants to hear it. So I won't give it to you, but I love that story. But the reality is, between 5,000 and 6,000 years ago, we learned how to read. How long has our dyslexic brain been with us? 5,000, that's so cute. It's so wrong. Thank you, that was very kind of you. No, this brain has been with us the whole time we've had this, our brain. For the last about 50,000 years ago, we've had this set of brains. What did I say? Set of brains. We have diverse brains because we have diverse functions as a species or we don't live. So that brain was here before reading was invented. What does that tell you? It's not a reading disorder. It's a different brain organization that is advantaged in many different ways Diane, where are you? Diane's, where is Diane? Did she have to step out? Okay, she and I were talking about our sons. Well, there are such differences in our individuals with dyslexia. I might just show you do you see this list here of all these very famous people? Do you know this one? Well, there's a hint in the middle of the name. There he is. My son, my first son, Ben, is prototypical dyslexic. He has a brain of an artist. He is spatially gifted. He could fix anything. He's technologically savvy. You just have a TV that has all these things, and I try to read and can't get it together. He said, Mom, please. Done. It's a different brain. Our species needs different brains. And the particular advantages of that brain are manifest in architecture, in artists, in wars, where there's no question that a dyslexic brain thinks outside the box. There's so many interesting things about that brain, and it's by no means a coincidence that so many of our, especially Silicon Valley entrepreneurs, have a history of dyslexia. In fact, one of the conferences I'm going to be doing another talk at soon is on neurodiversity and entrepreneurship. Why is it so many entrepreneurs have this history of dyslexia? It's because they have a different brain organization. We know that. But what we don't know is how to get this information into the hands of the public in a better way. Now, many of you, in fact, so many of you, are parts of groups that are trying to help the public understand dyslexia in a more nuanced way, just in the way we successfully, as a society, learn autism, the spectrum. We know so much more than we ever did, but we still haven't quite, if you will, cracked the conceptualization of the average person about dyslexia. I want to do that for 1,000 reasons. I want to for 1,000,000 reasons. Every individual deserves the right to reach their full potential, and this is not happening still in so many places. Part of my work literally is in Australia, where it's not recognized in 1/3 of this huge continent. You cannot take for granted that people either understand dyslexia or, much more to the point of our work together, know what to do about it when they are confronted. So a lot of the research now, this is my colleague Fumiko Haft, and my other colleague Mary Lou Gorno-Timpani from the University of California at San Francisco, and it is to combine so many of the different forms of our knowledge. And it's not just about what is different or what is, if you will, unconventionally accepted in the classroom. It's about all these strengths as well. How do we get our hands around all of this? We have to have multidisciplinary research. And that's part of my work, is to bring to you research that comes from various areas. Research that tells us, for example, this is my colleague Nadine Gabb at Children's Hospital, that tells us that when we study families with a history of dyslexia, we see differences in their babies from the start in an area of connection. And you see this in so many of the different research that Nadine Gabb and her colleagues have in studying where is this changing, what is different in the white matter, the structure underlying, what is different at different points of development. And so we're seeing a whole renaissance of research, not just on phonology, which here's again some of my colleagues and students. We've known this work on phonology since the 1970s, not physiologically. Only in the last 20 years have we known it physiologically. But what we're learning now goes well beyond what we used to know. Some of you may remember that part of my work in the last starting 30 years ago with Martha Denkla was to understand the role of naming Why? Because naming speed, along with phoneme awareness, are the two best predictors of reading performance, still across all languages tested. We can go beyond that, and we do go beyond that, but these two are important for you to understand. And for those of you who don't know about naming speed, basically what we're doing is, and here's just a quick picture, we're just asking the child, how many of you have not seen this, just so I know? It helps me, some of you have not. Okay, by and large, most people understand that what we're doing in this humble task is to be able to make the visual system connect to the language system in lightning fashion. And when we see it's working, we're not concerned. If we're seeing that there are differences, especially what we call the interstimulus response, when we see that, we begin to have a suspicion that that which will go and make that full brain fluent is not functioning at the same rapidity needed for reading. That's what this is. This is a simple index of how fast the component parts can work together. Now, the reality is that whether we're talking about phonology or naming speed, there are physiological, if you will, signatures for children and individuals with both of these tasks and with others. If you look here, you will see that our readers who are dyslexic are, look at this, they are different from our typical readers because their right hemisphere refuses to let go. The right hemisphere feels responsible in many, not all, but in many of our individuals. Now, I'm showing you this because I'm about to show you something that almost no one in this room knows, and I need you to be aware of what is happening in this new research by our group, John Gabrielli's group at MIT, the Brain Cognition Lab, and Nadine Gabb at Children's Hospital in Boston. Now, the paradox that everyone knows is this. Early identification would prevent a lot of our issues. But the reality is that identification usually happens in grade 2 or grade 3, or often, as not, in some of our kids. This is a really tricky one. There are tricky kids out there who will not show until 4th grade or even high school or even college. And there's a reason. Because their decoding is not bad. They can compensate, and I'm going to show you them. But the reality is, for most kids who have severe issues, you're going to identify them around grade 2 or grade 3. We know this. There's a study that we've just finished. Maureen Lovett, Robin Morris, and myself in our groups. Kathleen and Catherine were part of this group. This work shows us absolutely without a doubt that when you intervene early, you can prevent so much of the detritus of what happens next at so many levels. Well, the question is, if we know this early intervention is best, and we know that identification is coming later, what can we do to change that? And this is what's happening. This is the beginning, and this was just finished in 2018. This is the beginning of a whole new direction of research by our group, John Gabrielli's group, Nadine Gabb, and this is my very last PhD student, Ola Ozernoff-Palchik. This first was done in developmental science, and then she finished it 3 months ago for her dissertation. What we did, what this group, this large three groups together, studied more than 1,300 kindergartners from around New England. All schools, all differences, just you name it, we've got the gamut in this. And then we gave an entire series of many, many behavioral measures. They then boiled down to this group of measures that was, if you look at this down here, you have this entire group of phonological awareness, word recognition, letter recognition, etc. But I'll go back. But these became the major ones for prediction. IQ actually turned out not to be as predictive. We use it for a particular reason to control for it. But these became the most predictive. Phonological awareness, working memory, RAND naming speed, and letter sound knowledge. These are things everyone in this room can use. Everyone. The importance is that what we found were basically 6 subtypes or profiles. And this is the information, more than anything else this morning, I need you to realize. We can now, with a relatively small battery, be able to predict the direction of where the children will be needing most help. It's ongoing, this research, and I'll show you a little bit more of it in a minute, but I need you to grapple with what we're seeing. At the top line, you see this one group that are basically your expert readers in kindergarten. We don't want to do a thing with them. They're great. You give them good instruction and they're going to be fine. I love them, but I'm totally disinterested in their lives. Sorry. Now, this green line, except for one, is just almost insignificantly different from that top line, okay? Except one thing. What is it? This is the group you will never predict in ordinary batteries. They will go on in 4th grade, 3rd, 4th grade, to be the unexpected fluency and even comprehension. Not because they can't comprehend. They have an excellent IQ and they're doing well on everything, but the fluency impedes their comprehension. They are a subgroup that we systematically have been, not by intention, but we didn't see them because we didn't realize that there was anything different about them unless we tested for the RAND, which predicts fluency. This is our fluency group that we can see in kindergarten. By and large, this group is the group I get in college or end of high school, where suddenly the child has an adult volume of reading they have to do, and their beautiful compensatory strategies break down. They don't know there's anything different about them, and they come in, and the only thing that we get a sniff of is a lot of times, bless you, that they can't retrieve words at the same speed of other kids, and so they have foreign language issues. So it's an interesting group. But we can now predict it. That's the point. Now, this is another group that I love, but, please, just let them be. Okay, this group right here, the red, they're a group I am very interested in. The RAND group, quite frankly, I've known about forever. The world doesn't, but now it does. This red group is going to give us some real run for our money. They aren't doing letter sound knowledge in the same way. We're testing, and we believe there's 3 possible subgroups within there. One is an environmental group. They simply have no background, and we're coming into it. So we have to look at this group more specifically. They don't have the background knowledge. They haven't been exposed to letters and sounds in the same way, and that's part of the reason. But it's by no means the whole. That might also include a group who have a rarer form of visual processing issues. Now, we've excluded visual processing for so long in our field because we've been examining language at a level of subtlety that's really beautiful, but we have overlooked that some kids can have visual issues, and we think some of them might be in there. But there's another group that we are now looking at within them, and that is the history of kids who've had language delay. And we think they are in that group as well. So this is a group that we need a lot more work on. Now, the next two, these are the two groups, the blues, the dark blue and the light blue. These kids, if we look at the next slide, you'll see even better. This group here is what, in the old days, that blue, we'll look at them here, they are your multi-deficit group. They are going to, over time, become very well known to you because they will be the group that does the lowest across all things from then on. But in kindergarten, they're very interesting to us because in reality, they look like their working memory is okay, but not great. It's not great. But what you think is the most severe is this group here with phonology and working memory. This is the group that we've been best at identifying, and this one as well. But what we don't realize is that these kids, they're fine on the RAN. They will go on to be absolutely in good shape with our great interventions on phonology and phonological awareness. Now, this group, this more multi-deficit group, this is a group who's going to require everything but the kitchen sink. Now, the other group that's going to require more than you ever would have thought is our beautiful greeners. We do not know all the reasons why their naming speed is not working as well as it might. And so my recommendation is that this group and this group get our full Monty, if you will, the most multiple component approach we can have. This group down here, our phonological group, you have done a phenomenal job as a field of working with this, and I think we'll do fine with them. Now, the problem is, there's always a problem. This is really a small percentage of the kids. It's closer to between 20 and 30%. This group is closer to 20 to 30%, same numbers. And this group, they certainly need phonology and working memory, but they need a lot more than that. And they aren't necessarily getting it. So we have two groups making up 2/3 of our populations that need multiple component interventions. Yes? Only dyslexic. Oh, yes, very important. Oh my God, that would be really awful. No, what's wrong with giving all our kids multiple components, you know? I mean, this is a little pause here. I was at this conference that I organized at Stanford in January of this year, and the single best visual perception researcher in the world, I think Brian Wandell, was listening to all this. He says, so really, do you mean that what you do in interventions for dyslexia could help all kids? What does this group say? Yes! A resounding yes. Okay, now before I get too excited about all the other things I'm going to tell you, I need, who is in charge of me in time? I thought I had an hour and a half, but I see that with the introductions, I'm not at where I should be. So you tell me. We should stop now? Okay. Okay, I'm going to take 5 more minutes so that I end with you, and then we'll come back. Okay. So I'm just going to say that there are many things we can do to help the situation before we even intervene, before we even predict, and that is take 15 minutes. Okay, good. All right. And one of the newest forms of research that we've been doing is with Ola Ozernoff-Palchik and Ani Patel, a neuroscientist of music. And one of the beautiful things is that we have now a whole series of studies beginning with Kathy Moritz's study in reading and writing, in which we look at children who receive music training the first study was just in kindergarten. And in kindergarten, what we found is those children who receive music every day, as opposed to the same matched children only once a week, what do you think their first grade scores were? Who was better in reading? The kids with music training. Why? So we started unpeeling this. There's a lot of really new, really good research by Katie Overy in Scotland, and Ola and Ani Patel. All of it is now looking at what is it about music that is similar to reading enough that it could propel reading performance. Now, the reality is that what we're discovering is that the relationship is between rhythm in music and phoneme awareness. And so there's all kinds of studies that we are doing which show that the areas that are involved in music, specifically in rhythm, are helping to enhancing the same processes that underlie phoneme awareness. So it's a wonderful, if you will, innocent way of providing more to phoneme awareness than phoneme awareness itself before they even go into kindergarten. And in terms of your question, that would be good for everybody. And yet, how many of you have had your music and arts program struck? You know, this is really an ignorance on our part, and science is telling us what we should do. Now, I hinted at this earlier. There has been so many unnecessary fights and battles in local schools and school districts over methods since, you know, mid-century. You all know that. And the dividing line has been between phonics and whole language. And there is no question we need both. We don't need them called either of those things. I'm going to step on toes. All of the research from NICHD, and I've been part of that research for many years, and Catherine and Kathleen, they were part of this research. All of it shows we must have phonological awareness. We must have systematic, explicit instruction in phonics principles. There is no question. And if you have only one thing, just do that. But you don't need just one thing. And we also don't need to have half of our idealistic teachers alienated because they still believe religiously that they must follow induction principles of whole language. I need just to say to the world, this is not how to think. This is not a binary choice. There's no necessity to think either or. You must be systematic, you must be explicit, but I believe you must be also explicit about words, about how words work, about how vocabulary and syntax and stories and context, it all works together. And so I plea with this audience to, instead of saying the science, the research shows that we're right, instead of saying that, let's say, in addition, we must preserve the beauty of what you are emphasizing in stories and words. We can work together. And I believe we could also give an example to the country about working together across lines. We don't need those lines. The reading brain shows how essential it is to bring that visual phonology, graphing, phoneme, all of that has to happen in that beginning instant of the brain. And then it adds syntax, it adds meaning. We need to be doing it all. As usual, there's more claims on our time than we have time. But the reality is we need both. And we absolutely need to restructure the thinking of those who have zealously and idealistic followed whole language principles. We need to bring them on board because ultimately it's all about the kids. So we need to do a little Solomonic act here and say, preserve and expand all of us. preserve and expand will be aligned. So I ask you to look at now, Kathleen and Catherine will laugh, but we have done so much research for 20 years on looking at forms of intervention that go after reverse engineering the brain. Now, I'm going to be using several principles here very quickly. What I'm suggesting as one way to think is that you consider the reading brain as the basis, whatever interventions you're doing, for examining your own ways of intervening. Are you giving explicit attention to all those parts? Phonology, graphing, phoning, correspondence rules, getting them automatic, connecting them to the meanings, connecting them to their syntactic functions, connecting them to the morphemes, connecting the words to the sentences, to the stories. Are we doing that? Are we placing emphases on deep reading, which will be the second part of our talk? And are we putting enough emphasis on getting the parts fast enough individually and connected together? And so one of the things that we did in our NICHD program, we looked at programs that had those emphases, just phonics emphases, phonics plus morphology and word recognition strategies. That was the beautiful work done in Canada by my colleague Maureen. Love it. And then we looked at RAVO, which some of you have seen. That's our program in which we do look at multiple parts of the reading brain as the basis. But then Maureen and I decided to put all of our work together and look at the most multiple component intervention we could. And what we find are the results that there is no question that when we put all our work together, that we had effect sizes that were almost out of this hemisphere. We had never had such effect sizes before. And basically, I use RAVO for just 2 minutes to show you what I mean by multi-component. What we did was we looked at a program in which words could be celebrated, could be made fun, a courtship with words. So we worked on polysemy, where words can have multiple meanings. Those of you who haven't thought about polysemy, it's one of the toughest things for kids, that a word, that same word, can be used in different meanings. And yet, if you teach that from the start with words, they get the whole concept of polysemy. And here's some of the stories that are the worst in terms of literary quality, but the best in terms of semantic flexibility. So this, if you didn't get it, is duck. Duck. Okay, that's enough. But the reality is we had wonderful gains in reading and comprehension, and Catherine was one of our first teachers, and Kathleen was one of our first coordinators. But mostly we showed these gains, not just in normal reading, but in reading fluency and in vocabulary. And one of the wonderful things that we can now do is look at across all 10, 15 years of data, and we look at what happens when you look at children who get intervention in the beginning versus 3rd grade. And here you see, right here, the earlier you get your intervention into the kids, are better our effects. I'm going to end with this one. Our program was about reading. But the reality is when you don't read, and I look at Rob, we were talking a little bit about this, our children need so much. They need focus and clarity. They need to feel competent. They need to feel that they are learners. They need to feel that they are who they can become. And we never tested that very well. And leave it to the Italians. Leave it to the Italians. They wanted to know, and so they translated RAVO into Italian. And they studied and got the same basic replication on the reading results, but they went deeply into the social emotional and showed that after this program, the children's sense of their mastery, their sense of optimism, their relationships with the teacher and their engagement, and their overall sense of well-being just soared. And this is what we do when we restore the sense of learning and the love of it with our children. It's not, I am an apologist for reading, but reading is the vehicle to so much of a sense of who we are when we are young, and also our ages, whatever they are. But I want you to realize that what you are doing, and what I hope to help you do, is that when we connect our research and really go after our children with everything we've got, it's far more than about reading. It's about their potential as human beings, their entire life trajectory. So on that note, thank you for your work, and you'll come back and hear more of mine. Zoe. Yeah.
At this time, I want to encourage everyone to go over and visit our sponsors and get a little snack. We're also going to cut the break about 15 minutes short because I know we're all here to hear Dr. Wolf, and we want to make sure you have that opportunity.
Very nice to meet you. Thank you, Maria. I know your work. Oh my God. Oh God.
He's a greenie.
Is he really? Oh my God. Wow.
just been hanging out in here. There is lots and lots of food, bagels, yogurt, fruit, coffee over in Marion. So you still have time to run over and run back.
welcome back, everyone. We're going to get started in just a few minutes. It's a good thing I said that we would start 15 minutes early because maybe we'll start on time. If everyone can find their seat, I'm just going to go over a few announcements. Okay, in your folders, you will find some announcements for upcoming speakers for our next year's conference and also for a speaker in the Pittsburgh area in the spring. Some things that I want to remind you about. On your way out, you will see baskets. We recycle our name badges, so if you could please put them back into the baskets when you're leaving. And we really, truly recycle, and our past president, Lisa Goldstein, actually ironed some of the ribbons so that we could reuse them. So we are very environmentally conscious. Please make sure you do that. Our evaluation forms for your continuing education credits are color-coded. They are in your folders. Make sure you complete the evaluation forms and the 3 questions. If you are getting APA credits, you must sign out on this blue sheet. We will have either someone standing by the table where Dr. Wolf will be signing books, or if someone's not standing with us, it will be on that table. So if you need this, make sure that you sign it. And we put this little half sheet, just an event kind of evaluation for your preferences for date for next year. If you want to write preferences about location, is this a good location? Is it not? Any comments would be appreciated. About half of the folders have these in them, but we didn't have enough, so we will be walking down the aisles when we resume. If you need one, please take it. And as I already said, Dr. Wolf will be signing books after she takes a few minutes of a break. And thank you, and we're ready to go.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. I have to say, the people who organize this conference have made me feel so good. I get gluten-free cookies. I get all these fruit snacks. It's wonderful. So this is a hospitable group, a very gracious one. So we left off talking about dyslexia, but before I start my second, I hadn't given you about 5 slides, and I would feel remiss if I didn't talk about the kids who are struggling with reading but are not dyslexic. Who are they? They are ours. And I want to be sure that we talk just a little bit about them. Some of the very newest research by members of our lab, especially the same study that Ola Ozernoff did, was looking also at outcomes for children who have different social economic circumstances. And what we're finding is that's no surprise to anyone here, a risk factor, so that the kids who have lower SES have a double whammy in terms of their outcome. And the most recent work, and we're not going to really talk about that today, but we are now looking at the white matter differences. And so there are even physiological differences that we're talking about with our children, that even though we think of this as an environmental factor, it is one that influences how the brain develops in its different language and cognitive areas. And so we really have to take this so much into consideration when we're talking about all the things that go into our children who aren't learning. One of the excruciating facts about who is not reading fluently in 4th grade, remember I called that our hinge moment in elementary education, are our children who are bidialectical, who are African Americans or are Hispanic kids. And we see so many issues in terms of getting to be fluent by 4th grade. This is unconscionable that 61% of our children, especially boys, in 4th grade are not reaching fluent rates. And there are multiple reasons. One of them is, in fact, the dialectical differences. And I was talking to my colleague, Catherine Donnelly Adams, in the break, and it's really important when I talk about bilingualism or bidialecticalism. In a linguistic framework, everything is the same in terms, there's no inferiority, superiority here. We're all dialects, all languages are created the same. They must be kept. We're not discarding one language or one dialect, but we are ensuring that the phonemes of the language that will be read and that is used in the school, Standard American English, that is what the children are becoming very much fluent in. And there's a lot of great work by Julie Washington and Charity, Chip Gidney at Tufts, these Julie's at Georgia State University, in which we're really thinking about the need for code switching abilities in our young. There is no end of reasons why kids can't learn, but we can deal with some of the big ones, and dyslexia and differences in dialect and languages are some of them. Before she died, how many of you know Jean Shaw, who was at the Harvard Reading Lab for many years? Well, she was my teacher, and before she died, she called me up and said, Mary Ann, the most important group that we can do something about in American education is a 4th grade African American boy who is failing in droves. There is no question that this group is not succeeding, and the repercussions go from that moment on. If we can prevent that from happening, we absolutely must do everything we can. One of the newest special issues that will be in Reading and Writing is co-edited by Sean Robinson and Corey Thompson on this group of boys in our schools. I call them the forgotten boys, because the minute you leave 4th grade without becoming fluent, you become forgotten. And this cannot be. Whether we're talking about what happens to the social, emotional lives of our children who are in this forgotten category, or whether we're talking about the societal implications, because we know children who are forgotten, whatever their circumstances in 4th grade, go on to be higher levels of dropout, higher levels in prison, etc. If we think about prison alone, and part of my work in the future, I hope very much to be part of this, and Kathleen and Bill and I were talking about the inside-outside prison programs last evening. One of the things that I hope some of us can become involved in are working with those individuals who became prisoners largely because in 4th grade, in 3rd grade, they failed to make it at that level. We have to do something to prevent that as a society. I think it's 12 states, but it could be more, who are projecting prison beds on the basis of 3rd grade reading failure. We, in this room and in this viewing audience, we know what to do. Let us work even harder than we have to prevent those kinds of statistics. Now, I want to move us from this morning's foundation in understanding the reading brain, reading development, and the plasticity underlying that new circuit. For those of you, there are a few of you who could only come to the second lecture, so I'm going to say only 1 or 2 things that are repetitious for the rest of you. The reading brain never existed in the species. It doesn't have any genes in it. We create it. We create a new circuit. The circuit is plastic, meaning it will reflect the differences in the writing system. So there will be a different brain for a Japanese reader and an alphabetic reader. There are even differences in the alphabetic readers between English and German, Italian, Serbo-Croatian, Dutch, etc. Why do you think? Why would there be a difference in your brain between English, let's say, and German? They sound differently, and there's certainly that will be. Okay, the phonemes are different, but there's a really, you're getting close. There are differences in grammar, especially in German, where you have to put that darn verwenden, ich habe etwas gewonnen. Ugh. No. Accent's different, syntax is different, but we're not there yet. You got to come more basically. Prosody is different too. You guys are too smart. Think more simply. Yes. Say this very loudly. It never breaks its rules in the correspondence between grapheme and phoneme. It's regular. Actually, it's 85% true, but close enough. We are the language that has G-H-O-T-I, as you remember from George Bernard's bilious attack upon English, where G-H-O-T-I could spell what? Do you remember? You know this. Fish. Fish. G-H is in laugh. You got it. Okay. The reality is our brains follow the characteristics of the writing system and the medium. That's what I want those of you who weren't here this morning to understand before we begin. So, part 2, the reading brain circuit in a digital world. I'm going to begin with my colleague, friend, Sherry Turkle from MIT, who said this, and I want to preface everything we begin with this statement. We transgress not because we try to build the new, but because we do not allow ourselves to consider what it disrupts or diminishes. She wrote this in a book called Alone Together. We are in this hinge moment of a society that is going through a communication change, a huge transition. But what I want to say before we even get into the specifics is that I am not talking about binaries here as if print versus digital is the story. You and I have gone through in the morning a look at the various cognitive, linguistic, and affective processes that are in the reading brain. I'm not talking about something that is versus. I'm talking about what are the cognitive processes when we read print and when we read digital. And I want us to think in terms of process, not in terms of binary. I gave a talk last week in Italy, and some of the quote-unquote reporters were trying to say, oh, these people are, and they call them boosters of digital culture, are doomsters. Thought that was really clever. Well, that's just, and that the one was innovative, the booster of the digital culture, and the doomsters were old-fashioned and traditional and conventional. If you think in those terms, we're lost. I'm very serious. We have to think in terms of what are the cognitive processes that we wish to preserve, whatever medium, and what do we want to expand, whatever medium. Not versus. And if you think in terms of old-fashioned versus innovative, then you don't understand that that is an old-fashioned concept. That in itself is an old-fashioned way to look. We need to really think carefully this moment in our history because it's a matter of choice. And so I'm using a very, someone who really should be better known but isn't. So this is my version of Socrates up there. And he is looking into the brain of Diotima, his teacher, who was the originator of the Socratic method. I mean, come on, women. Diotima, we should have a Diotima 2 movement. Because she was the originator of the dialogue, if you will, as a basis of learning, and yet no one knows who she is. Well, I put her here to emphasize It's about choice now. We know so much in this moment of our transition. We never knew any of this when Gutenberg was, when we had the press, or when Socrates said we shouldn't read, and Aristotle and Plato became, well, wrote everything down that he said. And this is the moment when we can say, why shouldn't we do something, or why should we? And so I put this whole talk in terms of this is the moment to understand what we will gain or what we will potentially lose as we move into a digital reading brain. And it begins where we left off this morning in the very beginning of our talk when we started looking at the connections between decoding and deep reading. And here is where I want to get ever more specific. I began this morning by talking about Proust's beautiful look at the heart of reading as that where we go beyond the wisdom of the author to discover our own new thoughts. And that's going to be the leitmotif from this moment on. How do we think about the release of what I will ultimately call the contemplative, deliberative function at the heart of reading, which gives us the time to think new thoughts? Everything that we did originally about deep reading in most of our fields has been called comprehension. I need us to think much more nuanced in our ways because that will help us examine how digital reading and how print reading differ. And so we come to looking at what are some of the specific aspects of comprehension that I now call deep reading. People in literary studies have long called it close reading. Sven Burkhardt was the first to use the term, but he wasn't thinking cognitively. I have been using this term for 10 years to think about the cognitive, linguistic, and affective aspects that we need to examine to understand where we will change. The first is background knowledge, and it's completely related to analogical thinking. Now, these three here, I want you to think about in terms of what I will call the scientific method processes in your brain. That's what we do with information that we compare with what we know. So analogical thinking is almost at the basis of who we are as human thinkers. Because what we're doing all the time, what you're doing with me right now, when you read, when you listen, you are comparing what you already know with what I say. That's an analogical process that the humans are so good at making. But to do it, they have to have background knowledge themselves. Or think about this, you won't know what you don't know. It's a platitudinous expression with a lot of depth underneath it. If you don't know something, how do you make an analogy to it? You skip right over. And here's part of the rub that I'm going to be making, especially with some of our young people. And I just met one of our, I think you're our youngest member. It's so sweet. Thank you so much for coming. But the reality is that a lot of our young are so reliant on external sources of knowledge that they are failing to build sufficiently their own consolidated background knowledge. And this is like that Stanovich effect that for vocabulary, the rich get richer and the poor get poorer. Same thing for background knowledge. You have to be building it so that you can make those analogies. So this is an extremely important part of the process of putting together, oh, look at that. Okay, I should have separated them more. Putting all these scientific methods together. So if you think about background knowledge from a slightly different viewpoint, it's also what makes us the true readers. We are always adding to what went before. We're like, this is the most, I almost stutter when I think about this. But 1 week ago, I had to go back to LA from Italy just because I was to meet this man. He was my hero for years and years. And when you think about the people we read, they're our friends. So he, more than anybody else, wrote a book that I hope some of you will read, A History of Reading. I know several of you have. But this history of reading, in it, this is what he says. Reading is cumulative and proceeds with geometric progression. Each new reading builds upon what the reader, the reader has read before. That's who we are. We're constantly building it up if we make those analogies and process the information sufficiently to remember. Everything takes time, and that's going to be the next leitmotif in our discussion. So in terms of background knowledge, what we're doing is every time we read something anew, we are a different person. A few of you said that you've read my book 2 times. I think that's so wonderful. Because you read it differently when you read something a second time, because you're different. You're bringing more to it. Now think of, just shout out, what books have you read multiple times? Just shout out, let's hear. Multiple times. Bible. What? Little Women. Oh, absolutely. Any George Eliot types out there? Middlemarch. Oh, what about Pride and Prejudice? Oh, come on. How many have read it more than once? Come on, put your hands up. Oh, gosh. I thought there would be even more of you. What other books? What is it? Oh, Chronicles of Narnia, of course. Another one, quick. Harry Potter. Oh, my God. Other ones? Anybody else? To Kill a Mockingbird. Huckleberry Finn. What? Oh, Tuck Everlasting. There are so many beautiful things. And when you think of them, doesn't your heart kind of beat a little tiny bit? Don't you get a little chill just thinking about Harry Potter? I do. Oh, I mean, never mind. Everything is connected. Those readings, and you said this, the Bible, and the first thing I think of the Bible are the Psalms. Think of how you change when you read the same psalm. You read it and you find new meanings. That's one of the most amazingly precious aspects of the Bible in particular. Its spareness, its very spareness, leads us to bring new levels of meaning and in turn receive new levels of consolation and comfort from it. It's one of the greatest reciprocals in reading itself. But it begins with having this background foundation that we just constantly are building on. There's something else that I want to emphasize that's not a scientific method process, but that is equal in importance and equal in beauty. And that's the perspective-taking aspect to reading. When we read, we are transported outside ourselves. The theologian John Donne uses the term pass over. It is the capacity to pass over to others and come back to ourselves. We all have the capacity, but we do not all discover it, come to use it, learn to pass over. This is one of the most beautiful aspects in reading, where we leave ourselves to become other and learn the feelings of other. Now, what I suggest to you as a neuroscientist and as a person who studies literature, I'm going to actually come back here for 1 second, is that we have differences in our brain as the result of this. There is research by Tanja Singer in Germany in which, I thought I had a slide here, but I guess I deleted it. There's too many slides for you already. But this slide would have shown you that not only are you, when you are taking on the perspective of others, activating your emotional, affective regions, but also theory of mind. the theory of mind regions in which, like Machiavelli, that's the essence of the Prince, figuring out how another thinks. Well, when we take on the perspective of others, we are using empathy, affective empathy. And there are various forms of empathy. There's a great new book on the arts by Ellen Winter that she discusses these different forms of empathy. But what I tell you is that the neuroscience shows that when you're being empathetic, you are looking at also cognitive theories, strategies. So empathy, perspective taking, passing over is both cognitive as well as affective. We think of it as a feeling state, but it's a feeling state and it's a knowledge, a cognitive understanding of other, which leads us to yet another form of empathy, which is compassion and compassionate action. There are differences at every juncture between how we feel about other and what we do about it. Just as in the moral development literature, there is all the work by Kohlberg and Gilligan about how we develop morally, and I would suggest to you that there are differences aplenty between what we think morally and how we act morally. And that is a piece of our work in reading, because reading is and this is the work of Frank Hockemulder, reading is our moral laboratory for kids. Where do they learn, especially if they have no other affiliative function in their family? Where do they live? Where do they learn about how we treat others? Frog and Toad, George and Martha, Wilbur, Sharp, you said it, Sharp. I mean, these are the people and the characters and the animals who teach us what it is to be a fair, just, good human being. And reading gives us a chance to pass over. Now, I use this very, perhaps unusual way of talking about it. Marilynne Robinson, my favorite American novelist, wrote 3 books that if I could give them to you, I would give them to you before I give you my own book. And I quote in Marilynne Robinson aplenty. She wrote the trilogy that begins with Gilead, goes on to Home, goes on to Lila. If I had only one book for you to read in literature, it would be Gilead. Why? Because it is the essence of passing over into another life that this minister in Iowa describes. And the last president of the United States asked Marilynne Robinson, not the other way around, for an interview. He stopped over in Iowa where she was at the writer's workshop there, the writers group at University of Iowa. And he wanted an interview with her because he considered her the ambassador of empathy. And he said, and I actually dreamed about this last night. He said, before I used to read novels, I saw the world more in black and white. But after that, I would see it in all the varied shades of gray and gray and gray. And it taught me so much about what is moral and how complicated it is. And she responded, the trend towards seeing those different as sinister other is the greatest danger to continuing our democracy. I could not and will not make political statements in my talks. You may infer to your and my heart's delight, but I will give you now a quote from another novelist who said 4 years ago, I believe it was 4 years ago, her name is Jane Smiley, some of you have read her work. When asked about the novel and its relationship to other and how it teaches us, she said, I'm not worried that the novel's going to die. I'm worried that it will be sidelined. And if it is sidelined, we will have less people reading. And we will have leaders who do not read and who do not, therefore, understand the feeling states of others. And we will have barbarism that will encroach in our society. Empathy is part and parcel of what we teach through reading. Whether it's novel or story, whether it's a 3-year-old or a 30-year-old, we need reading at a deeper level so that these important perspective-taking qualities are not lost. We have other things that teach us in addition to empathy, and one of them is imagery. Imagery can be the voice of the narrator. It can be the very special uses of visual image to help. And our society in a digital culture, I think, is doing a fantastic job of expanding our visual imagistic skills. But I don't want to neglect how imagery can play a very important part of perspective taking and empathy. And I'm going to give you a 6-word short story by Hemingway. I smile and then I wince because this is very serious. He, in 6 words, wrote the equivalent of a punch to the gut in terms of empathy. Some of you know this story. It is a horrible, horrible set of emotions that we cannot stop ourselves. We use our background knowledge, we use our analogy, we use our perspective taking, and we say, stop, I don't want to go there. And all of this through 6 words. It was the product of a bet, a wager in Key West by some of his cigar-smoking, whiskey-drinking colleagues. And they said that he couldn't write a short story in 6 words. And of course, he never neglected a bet. And he said it was one of the finest pieces of work he'd ever done. And I agree with him. 6 terse words, and you understand better than I can tell you how imagery works in us to give us empathy and to give us another perspective. And here is the slide I thought I had lost, but I just put it in the wrong place. This just shows you how broad and how multiple the processes are that we activate when we think, just like what we did for that short story. We are literally leaving ourselves behind. Now, if there was anyone who personifies deduction and induction, it's Sherlock Holmes. And that's who we are too. And these processes all contribute to ultimately, not ultimately, penultimately, critical analysis. One of the most important things that we can give our children from the outset is to learn that when we decode, that's the beginning, not the end. That we have, from that point on, to put our mind to bear on what's going on in whatever story it is. And critical analysis is essential for us to inculcate in our young and to keep alive in ourselves. One more steady leitmotif through this talk is that it's going to be about critical analysis and empathy from the start to the end of my talk. We are endangering critical analysis because it takes time. We'll come back to that. But the story is not yet over about deep reading. So our brain takes all that background information, uses our analogy, and based on that, we make inferences, deductions, inductions, and then we come to conclusions. But our brain is better than Sherlock Holmes and much more like Miss Marple. Why? Because she adds perspective taking of other. She adds empathy for the crime. She understands the motives of the woman who killed her husband. No, I'm just sorry. The reality is our brain is like Miss Marple. She adds, and to what Sherlock Holmes, especially Benedict Cumberbatch's, what does he call himself, a sociopath? Yeah, he is. He only uses deduction. She uses more, and so do we. And so when we think about critical analysis, I want you to think that It's not just what those inferences give us. We can have inferences that are cognitive, and we can have inferences that are affective. We put together everything that we've got so far, and then we make evaluative hypotheses. These executive skills that we possess, it's like a dance between our frontal lobes to get information, make hypotheses, evaluate, come back, and say, yes, that's what is known. Now, I said, however, that that's the penultimate, not the ultimate. The ultimate is when, rare that it is, we take all that information. Now think, you had to process all of that information. It doesn't happen linearly, it's happening interactively. It all takes time. That's the biggest problem today. The time it takes to devote, to allocate to all those processes so that we have precious milliseconds to get to the truly last part of the processes, which is what the Proust heart of reading is about, when the wisdom of the author is gone beyond and we discover our own. That is the basis for insight and the generative processes of the contemplative function, the deliberative function that leads us to something that's different from what we just read. And then insight can come from a psalm. It can come from anywhere that we're reading when we give enough time to it. It doesn't happen all the time. And it can be as private an insight as can be, or it can lead to novel thoughts that help the world. But it is something that is very interactive. In fact, some of the brain research, Jonah Lehrer talked about this. He said the cortex is sharing one of its secrets. Well, the cortex is absolutely, it's completely alive with activation. When the people who are doing some of the studies are trying to analyze a meta-analysis of all the research done on these insights, they say, it looks like it's coming from everywhere. Yes, it is. All those deep reading processes are flooding us as we come to this very, very rare moment of milliseconds when we're thinking about it and through our own thoughts go beyond. Now, when we do that, you remember this morning I said I have a crush on Thomas Aquinas. There are very few people who can say that. But one of the reasons why comes from the G.K. Chesterton biography of him when he was asked, what is he most grateful for? And what he said was, I am most grateful that I understood every page I ever read. I don't know about you, but I sure haven't. And what a great goal it is. But I use him here because he definitely was using all of the processes that we know go into reading. And those people who say we only use a little portion of our brain, you know, that old canard, they have not studied our reading brain because it is a masterpiece of activation. However, and always, all of my stories have a however, this requires milliseconds to be allocated to those processes, and it takes years to form. Most importantly, think of plasticity. This deep reading brain circuit can never be considered a given. It has to be formed, and it has to be nurtured. You and I exist inside a platitude from neuroscience that says, use it or lose it. This, I will add to it at the end of my talk. But this is the situation with the time we allocate or fail to allocate, not through intention, just through the amazing amount of information we have. And so we come to the last parts of my talk in which we have to consider what's happening to that reading brain as it encounters the flood of information we are expected to process every day, which, by the way, is usually between 50 and 100,000 words a day. But the however is that it's not continuous. It's spasmodic. It's not focused. It's fragmented. My colleague at UCLA, Patricia Greenfield, before we ever knew each other, said this: every medium has its costs and weaknesses. Every medium develops some cognitive skills at the expense of others. The internet may develop impressive visual intelligence. The cost seems to be to deep processing, mindful knowledge acquisition, inductive analysis, critical thinking, imagination, and reflection. The deep reading. And she and I didn't know each other when she wrote this. But it has become a way of me talking about my concerns about our present moment, in which we are so bombarded with information, words, all images, all of it, that this is another colleague, Naomi Barron, who was at CASBUS, my friend Marie here. She was at a research center where we both were at Stanford. The real question is whether the affordances, the characteristics of reading on screen lead us to a new normal, one in which length and complexity and memory and especially concentration are proving more challenging. The reality is that the challenges are multiple. The evidence is absolutely, talk about geometric progression, accumulate. The first has been with us for a while. The researchers like Ziming Liu and others are saying that the new normal is skimming. When we have all this information, we are skimming it. Now, those people who are optimists and unaware of the research say, oh, I have to. I'm just filtering it for when I do my more serious reading. They don't realize they are bleeding over without realizing with that skimming mode. So the skimming mode basically is often in the eye movement research using an F. So we get the first line, go to the middle, and then go down. All we do is Z, down, we'll sample the word spotting here. Well, what does that do to the quality of reading? The quality of attention is changing in the skimming mode. Not only are we skimming, we're basically word spotting our way through half of the text we read. And when I say half, I should have said a quarter. There have been studies now looking at how our students, our college students, are doing their references. And what they're doing, the references are to the first page and the last. In between, God knows what is happening. But the reality is they are word spotting the very papers that one wants to teach them about methods, about thinking, about how arguments are made. And they are visually grasping that they have so much to do, they do the beginning and the end, just as we are doing on a single page. So we've got some real issues here. But the issues here are the surface. The issues here are what I'm concerned about. What happens is you are concentrating and focusing less. And we will talk about specific ways in just a minute what happens. You are in a distracted mode often as 27 times an hour if you are a teenager or a young adult. 27 times an hour, your attention is shifting to something. If you're on the internet, you're shifting right on that same screen, which believe you me is not their fault. I don't know, my next slide is, the novelty bias is what we're born with. It's a reflex. So when you see something new, your attention has to go there. Now this is something that helped us survive. If you had a predator, a track, or a poisonous fruit or something, you see it immediately. You can't stop it. And as a child, you are particularly vulnerable to the novelty reflex. But we all have it. And Daniel Levitin said this, Humans will work just as hard to obtain a novel experience as we will to get a meal or a mate. We can't help ourselves from looking at that. And that means we are in a landscape of distraction, especially on the internet, but we're also still within the set to be looking or whatever when we're on any screen. Now, before you go and think that I'm a Luddite, you may remember that it was said that I helped co-found Curious Learning, which is an organization that takes digital tablets to children who have no school in Ethiopia, in South Africa, in Uganda and India, and in some of our own backyard. So it is not I am opposed to screens. I am opposed to thoughtless reading. That's what I'm opposed to. I need you to realize we are not talking about binaries. We're talking about how do we understand, how we process cognitively and affectively information when we are so inundated by it. So if I go back one slide more, what is happening is if you are basically in this distraction mode, remember, the younger you are, the more susceptible. The frontal lobe develops over those years into young adulthood, and the frontal lobe will give you more inhibitory strength, okay? The older you are in young adulthood, the more that frontal lobe is developed and gives you inhibitory systems. So you can override it, though it's not easy for anybody, but especially if you're young, okay? So what is happening underlying all that, again, here we're talking about the top, skimming, which is what most of you do too. We're not, nobody here is an innocent, including myself, totally. We're skimming all this information. We therefore have less time concentration, and then our attention starts changing. We actually are demanding more stimulation, more, if you will, novel stimulation, more constantly. The younger, even the more that's going to be true. We are demanding it. Think of what happens when you go offline. Your hands twitch. You almost have to go to your phone to check. We have real issues in what is happening to our attention. Now, if it were only attention, that's one thing. But the reality is attention is intimately connected to the rest of all those processes. Attention is like putting a spotlight somewhere. But we have to put spotlights various places if we're to bring all the deep reading processes together, especially when we have enough attention to something so it can be consolidated in memory. Think background knowledge. What we have not done when we're skimming is give enough time to focus on something so it becomes part of our memory, which becomes part of our background knowledge, which becomes part of the basis for the rest of deep reading. Do you see where I'm heading? This is important for you to understand. Everything has a ramification. It seems so innocent on the top for me to say, you're skimmers. Ah, fine. No. Skimming is the beginning of the iceberg of change that we have to be cognizant of. So our need, we, not just our kids, we have this growing, increased need for constant stimulation, which leads to quasi-addiction, especially in our young. There are a lot of great people working on this, and working is the operative word here. We don't have answers. We have to examine and do research. We have never needed research longitudinally more than on this. There's very few people. Julie Poirot is doing some for younger people. There's a beautiful book called The Chalk, C-H-A-L-K, Artist, by Allegra Goodman, about the addiction of a boy that's like any teenager that we know. And I am particularly interested in this because I, on the one hand, want to be sure we understand what digital culture can do negatively. I want to understand simultaneously all that it can do positively. This is essential, especially for us who work with individuals with dyslexia, for whom that technological world, like it is for my son, is an answer like nothing else. I have two sons, some of you know this. One is dyslexic, one is dysgraphic. One is an artist, one is at Google. You can imagine the interesting conversations. They're my sons, and they teach me so much about how the entire digital world has so much that expands us. I need them, and I need myself, and I need you to know that it is not about looking at the negative. It's looking at what we want to preserve as we expand. That's the real issue here. Make no false binary assessment of what I'm saying. It's so easy to say, oh, she's for books. Yes, my little bag says I cannot live without books. That was a birthday gift. But the reality is, I cannot live without tablets either. I cannot live without my computer either. We have a society that really needs to understand the purposes for what we do when we read, because different mediums are going to be helpful for different purposes. The reality is we're all within what I call a digital chain, and it begins with how much we are expected to read, 50 to 100,000 words a day. Now, that will influence how we read. Can't help but not. You've got so much here, you're going to influence the fact that you need to skim a lot. But there's also something that happens. When you skim and you're going to be looking for shorter, briefer, less dense, comfortable, non-cognitive challenging material more than you realize. And what you then do as a society is that we tend to go to the silos of information that do not confront us with our differences, but that make us feel, okay, we only have so much time anyway, so let's go to that. And so we end up with cultures that have divisiveness. I'm not saying that's the only reason for the divisiveness of our society, but it is one of the reasons why I think people are more likely, more probably going when they have so much. It's a paradox. When they have so much, they actually narrow it. And so we really are getting more polarization, paradoxically, from all that's possible. And we have to think differently about all of this, because then what we read influences what is written. A lot of my friends are novelists, and they are being told, your writing is too dense, your writing is too long. You have to write briefer articles. And then we see what happens in some instances, and I've been getting letters ever since Prousing the Squid from professors of English who say their graduate students, not just their undergrads, their graduate students don't want to take the courses on 19th century and early 20th century literature because they're too dense. They can't, and this is my term, they don't have the cognitive patience to handle the density, the syntactic demands, the differences in that literature. Now, I love Hemingway. I love George Eliot. I want all our students able to read both. I do not want them to fail and do what some of our professors of English are doing, handing out assignments on short stories rather than novels. Short stories are fabulous. They cannot replace the long arc of the development of thought that novels give us. So what is written is being affected, which then translates into why we read in the first place. Let us never lose hold of what we began with in this morning. Why do we read? We read to go beyond the wisdom of the author to discover our own. Wisdom, not information. T.S. Eliot said, Where is the wisdom lost with all our knowledge? Where is the knowledge lost with all our information? That's what a poet said decades ago. I repeat it now from a neuroscience viewpoint. With so much information, with this glut in how much we read, we are losing knowledge, but even more precious still, we are losing the time it takes to get to the purpose of reading, our own best thoughts, our own wisdom. And so we need to think about what this glut, the paradoxical effects are, that there could be and already is increased use of reduced, less dense, and here we come to my real concern this moment in the United States. Unadjudicated information, less exposure to alternative perspectives that are adjudicated. We are leaving ourselves open in ways we never had to false information. We are increasingly susceptible for reasons that are all flooding us today. But let us not stop to realize there are implications for this failure to enter the deep reading part of our reading brain circuit. If reading largely changes to adapt to these fast processing, now remember, the affordances of digital culture are like a psychological set. I'm just like you. When I read on the digital screen, the affordances are to enable me to process ever quicker, ever more rapidly, ever more information, and be able to multitask. The multitasking literature is absolutely of one mind. The brain uniquely focuses on one thing. So when you're multitasking, you really aren't going underneath that task. You're at the very top of it. So multitasking is it's not what it seems in terms of brain time. You can do it, but you can't do it well. Now, if our brain is becoming ever more skimming because of what is happening and neglecting those deep reading processes, some of the implications are the following. We will have less ability to grasp complexity. You think you're not being affected, but in fact, when you're skimming, you don't have time to think about the complexity of the issues in front of you. You have less time to enter the perspective of other. You may do it at the top, but literally your own emotional immersion is lessened. And those of you who will examine yourself know that you may well have already begun to feel that your ability to be immersed is changing subtly. For some, it changes a great deal. What about how we have time to perceive beauty and to appreciate our culture, our whole heritage? And Calvino wonderfully said this about writing. Success for a writer consists in felicity of verbal expression, which every so often may result from a quick flash of inspiration, but as a rule involves a patient search for the most use, for the sentence in which every word is unalterable. You will never, ever get to the full appreciation of the words that were carefully chosen by some of your authors if you skim or word spot. You miss beauty. This is as important as cognition in my world of appreciating words. We will miss beauty, and we will miss references, and we will miss allusions because we're not building them. But there are still broader implications. If those deep reading processes of critical analysis and empathy begin to atrophy, which they are, and I will show you evidence in a minute, which they are, there will be less attention to others' viewpoints, more susceptibility to false information, and demagoguery. What is demagoguery but merely the desire to have people follow you on the basis of falsely raised hopes and falsely raised fears? This is for time immemorial. We go back millennia. It's the same story. That's what demagogues do. Falsely raised hopes, falsely raised fears in an intelligent population. People are still intelligent who follow demagogues, absolutely, but they cede their intelligence. They suspend it. They let it go to another. We can't let that happen. All of this ultimately threatens a democratic society because it puts us in tribes. It puts us in divided spheres instead of letting us all work towards for whatever person or persons for the betterment of our society. Now, there's a wonderful book that talked about society in a very particular way in terms of democracy. The delicate game of democracy. And we think democracy is just a given. It is not. It's an ongoing process that we build. Provides for a dialectic of opinions and beliefs in the hope that such exchange will expand the collective moral conscience that is the basis for orderly cohabitation. The last thing I thought as a neuroscientist I would come to is that this work on deep reading is about a societal's ability to handle multiple opinions and know that multiple opinions are what we need to come to some kind of moral way of being together. Multiplicity. We use diversity now, even diversity, as a bad word. Diversity is what our brains are. Our brains had to be diverse. We're a group here worrying about dyslexia. Diversity is the reason why we have the dyslexic brain in the first place. It's an example par excellence of how important it is to have multiple perspectives on our survival as a culture. Now, the implications for the next generation are what I want to go into. So I'm going to make sure I have my time right. Do I have, you tell me how much time I have exactly. Half hour, okay. I need to go through what the implications are for the young and for us. And then if there's time, I'll take questions. The reality is that most of our kids are now being given tablets or devices even before they are 1 year of age. You go on any plane, and only on the ones to Australia do I feel this seriously. I don't want anybody to have a tablet under 2 on a plane until I'm going to Australia with them. It's very rare. It happens. The reality is we're using it as a pacifier. We're using it as a babysitter. It's not that you can't use it. Of course you can. But think what you're doing in terms of the qualitative interactions that you are actually missing by not being with your child or with a caretaker or with a person, with a human. There's interesting research being done by Kathy Hirsch-Pasek and her group in Pennsylvania. There's interesting research done by pediatrician Barry Zuckerman and Jennifer Radesky, and it's all about guidelines to think about how we can best incorporate a digital culture with the needs for a slower culture in our children. And there is no question that, and this is some interesting research, there is no question that there are effects of great beauty when we are giving our young the tactile, concrete print that will, as we saw this morning, look at the activation that we are doing both expressively, receptively and expressively. But the newest research, which has not been published, but will be very soon, is when we compare what we already know from the Reach Out and Read research that's by John Hutton, when we compare that same group of people with reading a book by a parent versus an audio version versus an animated screen version. The Goldilocks effect is the following. What is best for the activation of those language areas is the book, is the parent or the caretaker or the brother or the sister reading to the child. That is better by some distance than listening, and much better than an animated version on the screen. Now, the work of people like clinical psychologists, bless you, Catherine Steiner Adair, shows us that there are increasing effects on attention and potentially attention deficits that are not physiological but environmental in our children who are overstimulated. I mean, basically comes down to the hormones. You get those cortisol levels going higher and higher because you're activating fight, flight more through those screens and through those games than the child will ordinarily process. So there's several things happening that's being studied now. There is a need by our children for continuous stimulation. The consequence is that their attention gets split. So not only do you have continuous need for stimulation, you get continuous partial attention. That's a line that I love. Now, they are doing multitasking all right, but what happens with this multitasking and doing different things is that they are becoming ever more inured to stimulation and therefore requiring higher levels of stimulation, which then results in, you tell me, what happens when almost any child goes offline? What is their first expression afterwards? Look, can you see, can you hear the consensus? I'm bored. Well, I ask you the question. When did you ever say that when you were young? And when did you ever have so much, quote unquote, available? There is, again, these paradoxical effects that we think we're giving them everything when we might be giving them too much and so much that they don't create for themselves. Many of you, when you didn't say you were bored. You were bored, but you didn't say it, but it was a different kind of boredom. It was, and the philosopher Walter Benjamin said this, boredom used to be a hatchbird for invention. Okay, now what? And then you go do something. God forbid you go outside, but many of us did go outside, and we played, and we invented things. I'm worried. I'm not worried that this is going to kill imagination. They will form and help form beautiful avenues for imagination that none of us can ever even imagine. That's great, but do not take away childhood. Do not take away a different kind of boredom. And so I'm really concerned as a cognitivist about what this ultimately means for their attention and attention's relationship to memory and memory's relationship to comprehension. And so now we're going to come to research that nobody in this room will ever have heard because I learned part of it last week. And that was in Norway 2 weeks ago. The reality is there is a group of researchers in Israel and Europe who have been studying this with great pertinacity over the last few years. They are finding very ominous differences in the comprehension of our youth, our high school and undergrad and graduate student population, when they're reading the same text on a screen versus in a book or print, okay? Same text, everything's the same. Only difference is the medium. And what they're finding is that the students are able to spend more time sequencing the details of the text, having greater comprehension afterwards on the questions asked of them. So it's, again, same smart kids, same smart students, same text, different performance because of one thing only, the medium. The one medium urges them to hasten on, which obviously adds to a likelihood for the skimming mode, which then takes away deliberative time for making sure they remember the details that go into understanding the text. Anne Mangen in Norway and Adrian van der Wiel have been doing, this is one of their first studies that pulled everything together. But now there's people in the United States, Lisa Guernsey, Michael Levine, Tap, Click, and Read, a great book. Naomi Barron, our colleague, Tommy Katsir in Israel. She did this same set of studies, but with fourth graders. She wanted to see how young can you see this effect. She's finding it as young as 4th and 5th grade. She's also finding some differences in empathy, and we'll come back to that. But my other graduate student and colleague, Marit Barzilai, who's in Israel now, Jenny Thompson in England, Anne Mangan in Norway, they are just completing a huge book on all of this. And part of it is summarized in a study that will not come out for a few months, but will be available. And it was done by some of the e-read network colleagues under Salmaron. What they did, they studied every they did what is called a meta-analysis. They put all the studies that had ever been done, carefully done, it had to be rigorous, on this text situation with the young, print versus digital. What they found is this, that print was better than digital across almost all genres, especially across timed conditions. Now, the surprise for me was this. I wasn't surprised that print is better because you spend more time allocating, so that made sense to me. But what I thought, and maybe you would think this too, is that the closer you get to 2018, the 2017, the better the kids would become digitally, right? Wouldn't that be your hypothesis? That they're so accustomed to it. They are now native. 2000 studies they weren't, but now they are. Opposite. The more digital native they are, the more they're skimming, the more they're not attending to the details. And that's what they're showing in their comprehension. Now, there was a study done in Israel, a whole series of studies by Rakafet Ackerman and her colleagues. She was at the Norway group. And what she was emphasizing is that the kids, the students, these are high school and college-age students, what she did was she did these same studies, but she asked them, what do you think you're better at? So she got what were called the perceived competence scale on what they thought they were doing in various things. What do you think? Did the students know or not know? They believed they were doing better on the screen. They do not have the perception that they are doing less well. So it is so subtle, it's imperceptible, these changes. Now, you put that into two contexts. This is not causal, it's correlational only, but I need us to look at it. The decline of empathy in the young has been going on for some time, but it has escalated over the last years. So the latest, these are qualitative studies. Sarah Conrath at Stanford, Sherry Turkle at MIT talks about this. But there is a decline, especially in the last 10 years, in the empathy indices of our young. Now, I would have thought it was the opposite. The more connected we are, the better I would have thought our empathy. And I believe that the students that I'm dealing with could not be more empathetic. So I'm dealing with this literature and want to delve into it more. We need better studies. But there is evidence that a lot of our youth are, in fact, no matter how connected they are, not feeling connected, not feeling the same kind of empathy that we would hope for. Now, you put all that in even a broader context in a study, again, that just came out, and the study is called Trends in the U.S. Adolescent Media Use, the Rise of Digital Media, the Decline of TV, and Near Demise of Print. Well, you can imagine it was like having a St. Sebastian attack. How can this be that we now have only 16% of our youth who are picking up a magazine or a newspaper or a book every day, which is 60% of what it used to be, and now we're at 16%. On the other hand, 82% are reading on social media every day. This is called displacement theory by these authors. What we have is an economy of attention that is happening, and where the attention is going to more our digital devices than to the kind of slower demands of print on a newspaper or a book. I'm not saying one doesn't have social media needs in our culture. I know that. But I am also suggesting to you that we must really figure out these things before it's too late. And here's some of the questions. Will changes in attention and the immediacy of external platforms of knowledge threaten the formation of internalized background knowledge in young digital readers? If they have continuous partial attention, are they really going to consolidate and therefore be building that background knowledge they need to make analogies and bring in their deep reading processes too? Everything is connected. Second, if background knowledge and attention are threatened, will inference and critical analysis decline, with young readers more susceptible to false information and less able to handle sophisticated text. We cannot have our very smart young really just not able to read the referenda because they're so dense. We don't have Twitter contracts. We don't have, tweets on referenda, though I'm sure there are those who would do that. It is not simple to live in our society, and we should not allow our young to believe it can all be reduced to 140 characters or less. So what I am suggesting, and then I will move into the adult concerns. What I'm hoping for is a preserve and expand approach to all of it. We need to expand the intelligence, the decoding, the encoding, decoding, coding, programming, all of these skills. And so what I'm suggesting is that we begin to think about a biliterate brain from the very start, in which we are developing, just like Vygotsky did, those of you who remember Vygotsky's model, parallel tracks for thought and language, in which we are developing, instead of thought and language, we are developing print and digital media literacies. So we are developing, especially in the early years, print up to about 10, developing deep reading skills through print and slower processing, and then explicitly teaching the deep reading skills to kids with screens. So they aren't developing bad habits, they're developing good habits. Simultaneously, we are using the screen for programming, for coding, for learning all these wonderful things that my colleagues like Cynthia Brazil and Marina Bears at Tufts and MIT Media Lab and Mitch Resnick in Scratch and Scratch Junior. All of these should be developing. Now, I'm going to look at Rob, because he told me about the Innovation Lab. I especially know from having two sons that our children and individuals with dyslexia can use technologies in ways that many other children cannot, and this is a really important aspect of their development, and we would be fools not to be developing it. We absolutely have this in our minds, but we, among all the people out there, know there are individual differences in our children. In as much as I think this is a pattern that would be extremely useful for us to do some research on, I simultaneously know, both from field work and from home study, that these individual differences exist, and some of our children would do better by doing more work on technology earlier than others. But in the broad population, I believe this model should be seriously considered and researched. There are those people in civics and history studies who are really developing similar, though they're thinking about older students, but they're thinking about lateral reading. as a very important skill. And this is Sam Weinberg from Stanford's group. And what they're looking at older students, but it's applicable to us. How do we inculcate critical analytic skills when our youth are reading online? And they are using studies of people like us and fact checkers to think about how we could learn to read laterally more efficiently and carefully. So he and I are thinking out loud together. My goal, and certainly Sam's as well, is ensuring the formation of deep reading across any medium. Here's where Socrates was wrong. Socrates says we shouldn't read. If he'd lived only 30 years later and hadn't been forced to commit suicide by a very interesting turn of events for him, he would have probably been like Plato and Aristotle, where he understood. Well, we need to understand both how do we preserve what we have in order not only to still contain our beautiful sanctuary as readers of books, but to be sure those same skills are able to be generalized carefully on the screen. So I'm not about medium, ultimately. I'm about deep reading and how to get there best for individuals. There are many different kinds of studies. I'm not going to go through this right now, but my colleagues in the e-read are looking at all of these factors that will influence us. I only add those here even 3 seconds worth so you know there's a lot of work that's going on in this area. I'm going to leave you in the next 10 minutes, however, with a look at you. My hopes for you, my hopes for myself, my hopes not only for children, but who the future good readers are. The book that I hope some of you read, Read or Come Home. Oh, and by the way, I want to tell this to everyone. You do not have to buy a book to come up and get my 5 seconds of advice. You come up without a book, I will sign a piece of paper. And some of you will have questions, and I will have a 1-minute hoped-for ability to tell you something, if I can, about a question. So please know that when I autograph books, it's for anybody, okay? Just know that. Okay, back to work. In my book, this was not the title I wanted. I didn't want Read or Come Home. I wanted Letters to the Good Reader. And my publisher said, no one reads Rilke anymore. They'll be lost. So one more illusion. Well, whether that publisher is right or wrong, they wouldn't let me call it that. But why I wanted to call it that was because I think we would be the better for understanding what Aristotle said about the 3 lives of the good society that I consider the analog to the 3 lives of the good reader. So Aristotle basically said that a culture can be judged by how it pursues these 3 lives: the life of activity and productivity, the life of enjoyment, they called it leisure, the life of contemplation. I believe the same is true for the good reader, that we have a life of productivity and knowledge, and that's wonderful. We're awash in that. We have the reading life of enjoyment, and that's a beautiful thing. But are we neglecting the 3rd life of the good reader, the life of the contemplative function, the life in which we go to that sanctuary, that holding ground where we can be our best and where we can have thoughts that we can't have anywhere else? And so I want to, in the next 4 or 5 minutes, let you have a quick look at some of my friends, authors I have read, who have said something I want to leave with you. This is David Ulin, who wrote a book about the lost art of reading. To read, we need a certain kind of silence that seems increasingly elusive in our over-networked society. And it is not contemplation we desire, but an odd sort of distraction masquerading as being in the know. In such a landscape, Knowledge can't help but fall prey to illusion, that speed can lead us to illumination, that it is more important to react than to think deeply. Reading is an act of contemplation, an act of resistance in a landscape of distraction. It returns us to a reckoning with time. My reckoning with time with you has been at the millisecond level and the year level. Millisecond, it takes milliseconds to allocate to those deep reading processes, and we neglect them at our own loss, but at a loss of society. Years, because it takes years to form those deep reading processes. And sometimes we can be so busy in decoding and the work on decoding that we ourselves neglect the very beautiful aspect that Catherine and Kathleen know was at the heart of our work in intervention. The heart of it was think. Think not just about what the text is, think for yourself. That was the third strategy in the RAVEL comprehension program. We need kids to think for themselves and to know that's the end. Decoding is the beginning. We give them the beginning, but let us never keep it disconnected from the end and from the very start. Second, what about society? What about society losing this unbelievable sanctuary that reading provides, the real immersive reading? And I use Dietrich Bonhoeffer. Dietrich Bonhoeffer was a minister in a part of Lutheranism in Nazi Germany who said, you cannot sing your songs or recite you cannot sing your Gregorian chant or recite your psalms unless you stand by the Jews. He said that as a Lutheran minister. He asked, who is Christ actually if Christ were here? I ask these same questions regardless of religious background. I ask these same questions now. And what did he have as solace when he was imprisoned? Personally killed before Hitler committed suicide? He wanted to be sure this man was killed. This is what he took. He took the Bible, he took Plutarch, and he took Goethe's poems before he died, before he was hung. And this is what he wrote. Passages from the Bible, books, all are invested with life and reality as never before. I live in a great unseen realm of whose real existence I'm in no doubt. We must preserve that sanctuary, that place where our youth, ourselves can go and be immersed in a world of our best thoughts and our worst thoughts and our saddest feelings and our happiest feelings. It's a place we can't lose. And yet I believe we're going so fast and we think we haven't lost a thing. I suggest to you, and I write this in letter 4, I tested myself. You can read that for yourself. It was a horrible experience to learn how much I had atrophied myself. Next, Marilyn Robinson. We stand at a threshold, as Bonhoeffer did. And the example of his life obliges me to speak about the gravity of our historical moment as I see it, in the knowledge that no society at any time is immune to moral catastrophe. We owe it to him to acknowledge that these challenges can be understood too late. When people talk about false facts and false information and lies and all of this, you think it's superficial, but underlying it is the deterioration of truth and our laziness and our indifference at ensuring that we have something close to the truth in our organs of society, whether it is the press or the courts. We must insist as a society on deep reading by our members and its formation and its continued use. So what we thought of as reading is not just something to be taken for granted. It is so much more aligned to what is the hardest, most important aspects of our responsibility to the young. And I will end or semi-end with this. There's always one more slide. With Martha Nussbaum. It would be catastrophic to become a nation of technically competent people who have lost the ability to think critically, to examine themselves, and to respect the humanity and diversity of others. And unless we support these endeavors, it is in such a nation that we may well live. It is therefore urgent now to support curricular efforts aimed at producing citizens who can take charge of their own reasoning, who can see the different and foreign, not as a threat to be resisted, but as an invitation to expand their own minds and capacity for citizenship. This was written 20 years ago. It has never been more true. We need choice. We need to choose who we will become. Who will we become as readers will determine who our youth will become. And they will determine what our future as a species will become. Because so much is happening in so fast and telescoped a time as this. The discernment of truth and wisdom, the turning of contemplation into virtue and action, these are the acme of the Reading Act. They will depend on the allocation of time we give the full range of cognitive, affective, and moral processes underlying them, in ourselves and in the next generation of the species. This time, this hinge moment, our hinge moment, let us choose with all our intelligence. Godspeed to you. Thank you. So now I have the organizers. I know I'm to go do something.
I just want to say thank you, Marianne, for your just-in-time message for today. And it seems really ridiculously trivial to remind you of trivial things like your name tags and your CEU forms, but I have to do that. So I'm sorry to interrupt that amazing message at the end. So quickly do what you have to do and get back to reflecting. Thank you.
Where do I go? Oh, I'm over there? Okay, thank you. Oh, okay. Yeah.
People can wait.
Okay, thank you.
That was amazing.
Thank you.
It's everything
Thank you.
about this new initiative and everything.
Have you sit up right over here when you're ready.
Okay.
Right.
I also work in the school prison pipeline.
Thank you
Do
very
you
much.
really? Oh,
Wonderful.
thank you. Appreciate that.
One thing about the digital thing that I had read was that when you don't have a book, you're not anchoring with other senses.
It's true.
And there was some study,
There's been a lot of
when
study.
you're holding a book,
Yeah,
you kind of know where you are.
That's right.
In terms of the beginning, the middle,
exactly.
the end.
And that's